The makers of the Saints Row franchise are back, but this time they've decided to try their hand at something a bit different. Drawing heavy inspiration from Saturday morning cartoons, in particular those of the 80s and or 90s, Agents of Mayhem may conjure up a few nostalgic memories, but can it manage to also deliver an enjoyable experience? Set in a futuristic version of Seoul, South Korea, Agents of Mayhem introduces us to a world where the titular agency of Mayhem is trying to prevent the terrorist organization of Legion and their leader Dr. Babylon from taking over the world. Yup, it's pretty much a sci-fi version of G.I. Joe, which didn't really work out for that actual franchise, but it works well enough here. Considering the premise of the game, I guess it's only fitting that you don't just take the role of a single operative. No, instead you get a fairly wide choice of agents to play around with, at least if you decide to go through the missions that unlocks them, which I would recommend. How else would you find out how remarkably unique and well defined each and every character seems to be? Well, okay, so you won't necessarily feel the need to use all the agents to the same degree. After all, you can usually pick pretty much any characters for any mission, as only a very small portion of them require specific agents. Actually, they usually only require specific skill sets, which even further diminishes the need for specific operatives. Still, it is nice that each of these agents do have very specific personalities and traits. They all have their own backgrounds, motivations and relationships, not to mention their own weaponry and skill sets. While it will be up to personal preference which combinations of all of this you end up choosing and or sticking with, it's all but certain that you'll find at least one that suits your tastes. Actually, that will rather obviously depend on whether or not the game itself is worth giving a shot, which in turn depends on the actual gameplay. In essence, the game involves taking 3 agents into the field as you go on various missions to stop Legion's evil plans. You only control 1 agent at a time though, but you can instantly change between them at any time with a simple button press. The missions themselves are mostly pretty enjoyable, involving everything from taking over enemy outposts to destroying their machinery and stealing their intel. There are also several smaller and more optional objectives, and although most of this is all well and good, it does become rather repetitive and formulaic after a while. As you may have guessed though, this is an open world game, so you could just explore and play around in it if you wanted. Not that there would be much point in that though, as this world is actually pretty tiny, and there's not really all that much to do outside of the actual missions. Sure, the so-called tasks are a decent enough distraction I guess, but no, they're not all that fulfilling. The actual combat is pretty fun though. Oh, it can get rather hectic and occasionally you might feel a bit overwhelmed, but with a bit of practice and or a properly selected team, most battles should be fairly enjoyable without losing too much of their challenge levels. It's just a shame that they all seem to fall into the same patterns every time. Well, I do have to say that the boss fights do tend to liven things up quite a bit. They're still similar to the normal battles, but they also tend to have a few interesting additional objectives, and the stage settings and scenarios alone make them far more entertaining than the usual encounters. I only wish there were a few more of these a bit more often. I guess I should talk a bit more about how combat actually works though. For starters, every agent has a main attack, usually consisting of firing their chosen weapon. Some have a few options to this, like an additional firing mode or combo possibilities, but yeah, this is pretty much the standard attack. In addition to this, each agent also has a special ability that works on a cooldown system. These abilities can take the shape of an extra strong attack, grant you various enhancements, and or inflict various debuffs on the enemies. While these abilities can be very useful, some are way better than others, so how often you actually end up using them will vary greatly. On top of that, you also have the so-called Mayhem abilities. In essence, you have a Mayhem meter that will charge up as you take part in battle. Once it's full, you can activate an agent-specific ultimate ability, usually inflicting massive damage to the enemy and or granting extremely powerful extra features, buffs and debuffs. Essentially, these are more or less finishing moves. All of this works extremely smoothly, and the balance between the normal, special and Mayhem abilities is almost perfectly handled. Okay, so it might be a bit too easy to fill up your Mayhem meter, and some specials are a bit too powerful for my liking, but then again, there are times when these things are all but essential for a successful mission anyway. There are also a few RPG elements to this game. As you complete your various objectives, your agents will gain experience points and level up. You'll also receive upgrade points once in a while that can be used to manually upgrade various extra stats of your characters. In addition, you can also find and collect so-called upgrade shards and cores that are used to unlock various additional skills. Most of these upgrades and other various unlockables and extras can be accessed and managed either within the squad menu or from your hub, the so-called Arc. This is basically your base, and it's where you'll be going to switch out your squad, send out inactive agents on off-screen global conflict missions, and or manage your selected gear and vehicles. Yeah, this game does have vehicles, and although you can actually use any car roaming around the city if you want, it's not really recommended. The thing is that you can just as easily call for your official ride by pressing a single button, and none of the public cars are anywhere near as good. They're all really slow and or weak, so there's honestly no point in having this option. In addition to all of this, you also have access to what the game calls gremlin tech. These are additional single-use items that can be crafted and equipped to your squad, and they can do pretty much anything from calling down an airstrike to resetting your wanted level. As many choices as these may give you though, I found myself pretty much using just one of them for the entire game. You see, while all the gremlin techs have their uses, none of them are really as useful as the one called Mulligan. This tech is used to instantly and automatically revive your squad to full health when and if they all die, meaning it's a pretty good idea to have a few of these on hand once they're available. Sure, some of the others are decently effective as well, but this one is literally a lifesaver. It's also worth mentioning that there's absolutely no multiplayer portion to this game. Now, I don't really mind this myself, but this does feel like the kind of thing that would be pretty well suited to a multiplayer environment. As a matter of fact, it almost feels as if this was originally intended to be something akin to, say, Overwatch, but then they suddenly ran out of time or money or something. Ultimately, Agents of Mayhem is a decently fun ride while it lasts, but it quickly gets very repetitive and most of the side missions and extra objectives end up feeling like a giant waste of time. It's also littered with admittedly minor but very frequent bugs and glitches, all of which makes the game come off as a bit rushed and incomplete. If you're curious enough, there definitely are worse games to pick up, but I don't think I can give this a very high recommendation. Oh, I had a pretty good time with it overall, but to call it anything other than average at best would be stretching the truth a little. You might have a completely different experience with it than me, but if anything, I'd err on the side of caution with this one. While I have the time though, I also wanted to talk a bit about another title that came out relatively recently. It's not exactly the biggest game in the world though, and after having completed it, I think I can wrap up my thoughts on it relatively quickly, so I guess this is as good a time as any to give you my opinion. The game in question is Uncharted: The Lost Legacy, the standalone expansion to Uncharted 4 featuring Chloe Frazer as our protagonist. As a fairly big fan of this franchise, I expected this to at least be half decent, and to the surprise of absolutely no one, it doesn't exactly disappoint. That said, I wouldn't really call it completely brilliant either. As mentioned, this game focuses on Chloe as she searches the mountains of India for the fabled lost tusk of Ganesh. In order to do this, she has enlisted the help of Nadine Ross, who apparently lost control of her mercenary company Shoreline after the events of Uncharted 4. Unfortunately, they aren't the only ones on this quest, as they also have to contend with a somewhat boring new villain. Don't get me wrong, this guy isn't the worst villain or anything, but he's just kind of a dud. His name is Asav, and that's about all we get to know about him. Well, maybe there were a few minor little tidbits as well, but apart from the fact that he's a bit of a merciless lunatic who also happens to be after the tusk, I certainly don't remember anything else of note about him. Either way, this all sets the stage for a mountain climbing, jeep driving, baddie shooting adventure all over the Indian mountains. None of this is all that new for anyone who's played any of the previous entries in this franchise though, but that's not necessarily much of an issue. After all, the other games were generally pretty enjoyable, so more of the same isn't really a bad thing. That said, there aren't really any additions this time around. Sure, some of the previous titles only added minor improvements, and this is at least technically speaking just an expansion as opposed to a full sequel, but a little something to set it apart from the rest still would have been nice. Actually, there is one little addition this time around: lockpicking. Yeah, during this adventure, you'll occasionally come across these lockboxes containing various weapons, ammo and/or treasures, but getting into them requires you to lockpick them. As far as additions go, this is pretty pathetic to be honest, and if anything, it is used a bit too much, but I guess it's neat enough. I will say that this is used to pretty good effect on a few occasions. Oh, the actual lockpicking mechanic isn't anything all that unique or interesting, but when you have to do it while being stalked by a tank or hunted by a helicopter, it does add that extra little bit of tension and suspense. I guess what I'm saying is that at least they tried to do something interesting with this tiny addition. Things might also be a bit easier this time around, especially when it comes to finding the treasures sprinkled throughout the game. You see, if you complete a relatively early optional quest, you can unlock a trinket that actually helps you find treasures by glowing and vibrating when you get close to one. No, this doesn't ruin anything, but it just feels like a pretty odd and unnecessary inclusion. The fact that you're now playing as Chloe also makes a teeny bit of a difference, I guess. I wouldn't really say you'll notice too much of a difference between her and Nathan in terms of gameplay, but you should be able to tell that they're not quite the same. Unfortunately, you might also notice an even bigger similarity than usual to a certain other treasure hunting adventurer. Yeah, it's always been hard not to draw comparisons between this series and Tomb Raider, and this time around it's absolutely impossible. No, this definitely isn't a direct rip-off of Lara's adventures or anything, but I for one could not help feeling like I was just playing as Miss Croft this time around. Honestly, they pretty much made Chloe into a clone of Lara. I'm not talking about a physical resemblance here though, I'm talking more about their backstories and motivations. You see, over the course of this game, you'll learn that Chloe's father was an archaeologist that spent his life searching for the tusk to no avail, which is why Chloe is now searching for it herself. Isn't that just Lara's story with a few names and settings changed around? I guess this ultimately doesn't matter that much, but it is a bit distracting, at least to me. Maybe I'm overreacting or misremembering some things, but throughout this adventure, I just kept feeling like I was playing a Tomb Raider game masquerading as an Uncharted game. Fair enough, the Tomb Raider games can be pretty great as well, so this isn't necessarily that bad, but it does feel a bit off. Actually, that might be a bit inaccurate, as this ultimately still feels like more of the same things we've come to expect from this series, only with a different lead, villain and setting. I definitely enjoyed my time with it, but at this point, this formula might just be a little tired. Maybe. I mean, it's certainly not bad, not by a long shot, but I for one just found this one a bit underwhelming. Yeah, for better or worse, this really is just more Uncharted with the tiniest of additions and tweaks, none of which are enough to make the game stand out all that much. Hell, they even downright copy a few of the series' more infamous set pieces, so all in all, it just ends up feeling a bit too familiar. This is still a pretty decent entry in the franchise though, and fans of the series will more than likely find it enjoyable, but if you're expecting a completely different take on the series or something a bit more unique, this isn't what you're looking for. Fans of the series should probably consider giving this a go, but even for them, I wouldn't call it an absolute or immediate necessity.